Reproductions. I'm Ben Hoffman, and thank you for joining in with us today. Our subject today, I don't know how well you can see it on camera, I'll hold it at a different angle for you as we go on here, is going to be 18th century leather dyes. And more specifically, we're going to cover the color of black. Black in the 18th century was one of the most common types of dye that was used on leather gear, especially in the military, largely due to the fact because it was of ease to manufacture. The type of dye that we're going to cover dates clear back actually into the medieval times, heavily used in the 18th century, but even much earlier, on up through the American Civil War. This type of dye was used, and it was used largely because, again, it was so easy to manufacture, but it also worked extremely well. It was only replaced in the 1860s, just after the Civil War, with the discovery of coal tars, and that made the dyeing process easier. It wasn't so much better, it was just easier. But this early form worked very well, and it was used quite a bit. Typically today, in reenacting, you see a lot of dark browns on leather. It's not that that's incorrect, but the blacks colors should be there also because it was so easy to produce and it was very common. We'll go into detail about how to make the dye here in just a minute, but in nutshell version is, if you had some vinegar and you had some iron filings, iron nails, any kind of old discarded iron bits, you could create this dye. So that's what I was doing when we started filming here, getting ready to show you how to do that. But just to back up a little bit, leather in the 18th century, there were several different ways that they could go about tanning it and producing it. One of the more common is what's called vegetable tan, bark tan, or oak tan. And as the name suggests, largely it was the tannins were drawn from oak bark, also hemlock bark, rendered down, and soaking the leather in that, it would create a tannin and it would tan the leather. This type of dye has a reaction with those tannins that's in that leather, so it's not actually a pigment-based dye. What's happening is a chemical reaction between the vinegar and the iron and the tannins that are in the leather, and it will produce a nice black color. It doesn't work on all leathers that are produced today. Leathers that are tanned using various chemicals, this dye will not work on. You have to get either what's called oak tan or vegetable tan, and that has those natural elements there that this will react with. True bark tan leather, you can get it today, made by a handful of traditional tanners in the US, but it's very, very expensive. A good alternative, again, it's called oak tan, bark tan, or vegetable tan. It's a mix of modern and old-fashioned substances, which is largely what I use here today, and this dye will actually work with it. So first we're going to show you how to make the dye, and then we'll go ahead and show you how to use it. So you need just a few basic things to do this. Any type of a glass vessel or ceramic vessel, and the size can be whatever you want depending on how much dye you want to make. Here we have just a small jar to demonstrate the process, but glass or ceramic, any type of a metal container the vinegar will react with, and it can mess your dye up. So you want to go with some kind of glass or some kind of ceramic. And then you want to get simple vinegar. Excuse my non-period correct containers here. I didn't have time to get those in a row. But this is just simple distilled white vinegar that you can get at any grocery store or whatever. I find that this stuff, it's cheap and it works really, really well. So a little vinegar, and then what I use, you can use all kind of substances, but what is very easy to use, readily available, is steel wool. Some people like to soak it in rubbing alcohol or acetone first to remove the oil. I don't. I find that it doesn't really make much of a difference. So standard steel wool, the finest you can get, so that the vinegar can dissolve it with relative ease. So I have a little bit of vinegar in there, but all you're going to do is just pull the steel wool apart. I'll pull it apart away from me, it's shedding, and just put it down in there. You don't want to pack it real tight, somewhat loose. And again, it depends on how big the container is you're using. Obviously, if you have like a gallon-sized container, you're going to need a lot more steel wool, but you can make that amount if you think you're going to use it a lot. I tend to make it in about half-gallon increments when I make it, so that's about full. And then you just take the vinegar and you want to completely submerge the steel wool in vinegar. That's the right amount. We got that filled up. And now you just simply set it somewhere safe and let it slowly dissolve the vinegar. You want to keep it covered, but make sure the lid is not tight because there will be various gases that are formed. And if you have a real tight fitting lid, that can kind of, not with the force of a bomb, but make kind of a mess as it would burst. So make sure whatever you put on there is loose fitting so the gases can escape. Now you want to set this aside for about 2 weeks. 2 weeks to a month is what I find it takes to break down the iron and give you a good dye substance there. So this isn't the kind of thing that's going to be ready in a few days' time. You need to plan ahead if you want to use it. And also it seems with time this dye works better. So kind of like a wine aging that gets better, this stuff gets a little better as it ages. So don't be in a hurry if you're making it. It's not going to be ready tomorrow, so plan ahead if you want to use it. But you just set it aside and it'll do the work for you. So after the proper amount of time has gone by, this is actually almost empty. I have a new batch going. The solution that's down in here is the finished dye. And this was known by several different names in the 18th century. Iron sulfate, if you want to get technical. Vinegroon, it's also been called, and copperas. Those are all names that were used in the 18th century that would be a proper description for this dye. And to use it, it's very simple. So I'll start off here with this first piece. And this is a piece of 7 8-ounce cowhide that hasn't been treated. You can see it's nice and clean. And a lot of times I'll do my dyeing on my leather before I actually make the item. That way I don't have to worry about waxes or oils or fingerprints on it. And the neat thing about this dye is, not being a pigment based, it doesn't come off. After this has been treated, you can run it under water, submerge it in water, and it will not come off because it's a chemical reaction. And also upon exposure to light, it'll actually get darker. So the more you use it, the better it's going to look. So you start off with a clean, clear piece of leather. I also might add that before you use the dye that you've made, you want to strain it because it might have some particles in it. So through a cheesecloth or a coffee filter, you've got good clear dye. So you just take, I just have a clean piece of rag here. If I'm doing a lot, I'll use a paintbrush or a sponge. That works really good. And you just get the cloth or sponge or whatever good and wet. And you just start rubbing it on here. And this is, I don't have a lot left in here, so I'm kind of running out, but you can see the chemical reaction that's taking place there. Just instantaneously, it's starting to turn a blackish color. Now, that's just one light coat. If I was actually doing this for keeps, I'd put it on a little heavier, but just to demonstrate it. And you'll notice when it starts to dry, it doesn't have a very nice looking black color. It will have kind of a bluish gray color that does not look very good, and that's because this is a multiple step process that I found to get a good dark black color that they used in the 18th century. So after one coat, again, I'd put it on a little heavier than that. If this was the actual item that I was using, I'd like to set it aside for about a half hour to let that first coat dry. So after about a half an hour, I'll go ahead and hit it again with a second coat, and it starts to look a little better, but still it doesn't look too good. It has kind of a grayish blue color to it, and you know, you think of the sharp looking accoutrements of a British or American soldier in the 18th century, or a nice dark shooting bag. That's not really what you're going with. I don't know if you can see that on camera, but it doesn't have a very good color. Now the reason that is that, again, modern leathers don't quite contain the tannin content of historic leathers. It's a mix of substances that they use. So what you have to do to get a good dark color is reintroduce some of that tannic or tannins into the leather. And that's what this next piece shows. This nasty looking little container that I have here has a black watery substance that's called tannic acid. Now, tannic acid is nothing more than the tannins that have been extracted from bark. All kinds of different barks have it. What was used a lot in the 18th century is oak bark, and that's nothing more than oak bark taken off a tree, chopped up, thrown in a pot with water, and allowed to be rendered down and reduced. And the fluid that you have left over after straining that is tannic acid. So the more tannic acid you put into the leather, the more it's going to react with the dye that we have, the better the color's going to get. So you can see this piece here is 2 coats of the stain followed up with a coat of the tannic acid, and you can see it's a much better color than what we started with there. So 2 coats of the stain followed up by a coat of the tannic acid, and again I'll let these dry about a half an hour in between, and then it starts to take on a much better color. After that coat of tannic acid dries, I'll hit it one more time with the dye solution, the iron dye solution that we made, and it really starts looking good then. After it's thoroughly dried, a couple of hours, what you want to do then is take neat's foot oil, pure neat's foot oil. You can buy that a lot of places online, leather supply shops, even saddle shops. TSC I think sells it, the pure stuff, 100% pure neat's foot oil is what they used in the 18th century, and recondition this leather and rehydrate it. When you start doing that, the black color really starts to look good. You don't quite stop there though. If you want a slight sheen to the leather, I'll go ahead and polish or burnish that with a piece of wool, and then top coat it with a wax, which is a mix that I have of linseed oil, neat's foot oil, beeswax, and a couple other little secret things added in there to get a nice shine to it. So if you do those steps, again, a lot of people know about this stain, copperas, iron sulfate, vinegaroon, but a lot of times they leave out that tannic acid step. And you kind of have to do that to get really good dark colors, because the leather's not quite tanned like it was in the 18th century. We have to introduce more of those tannins into the leather to get the same kind of good reaction that they got back then. So after you take all those steps and you do the oil and the wax, then you have a really, really good looking dark black leather. It wears exceptionally well in all weather conditions, and because it's a chemical reaction, like we said, it's not going to come off. So again, this type of dye was used very largely in the military forces, both French, English, American, and again on the frontier it was sometimes used, because all you needed was vinegar and some type of iron, and you were good to go. So that's kind of the rundown on period leather from the 18th century. We hope you enjoyed this video. We have a lot more how-to videos planned as time goes on. So again, thank you for being with us. If you have any questions about this process at all, or if I've confused you in any way, feel free to comment, and I'll do my best to answer any questions you might have. So once again, thanks for tuning in, and until next time, take care.